After almost 10 full years of war, the legendary Ukrainian fortress city of Avdiivka has fallen. Ever since Russian forces launched a massive offensive on the city in October last year, Avdiivka has been the undisputed hotspot of Russia's war against Ukraine. Russian forces have suffered losses at a record rate in the area over 4 months of fighting, approaching or even surpassing those of the Battle of Bakhmut last winter. But despite soaring casualty figures, they just kept coming, backed by seemingly endless supplies of ammunition and equipment. Finally, on February the 17th, while President Volodymyr Zelensky was in Germany for the Munich Security Conference, Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky gave the order for exhausted Ukrainian units to retreat.
Логічне, справедливе і професійне рішення зберегти максимум українців.
The battles here have been fought with a mix of massed conventional fires and manpower on one hand, but also with revolutionary new technology which foreshadows the future of war in the 21st century on the other. As the dust settles on one of the bloodiest engagements of the war, many questions still hang over the Battle of Avdiivka. How did Ukraine lose such a strong fortress city? Was the order to retreat given too late? Was Avdiivka strategically significant or not? And what comes next? I'm Francis Farrell, a reporter here at the Kyiv Independent, and I'm here to answer these questions while breaking down the key events in the battle step by step. To follow the latest news from Ukraine and get deeper into developments on the front line and in the rear, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Situated less than 10 kilometers north of the Russian-occupied regional capital of Donetsk, Avdiivka was a small industrial city with a pre-war population of about 35,000. Before the war, many people traveled back and forth between Avdiivka and Donetsk for work, while the city's own economy was dominated by the sprawling Avdiivka coke plant, one of the largest of its kind in Europe. The story of Avdiivka is a reminder that Russia's war against Ukraine began not on February 24, 2022, but almost 10 years ago in early 2014. Amid a wave of Kremlin-coordinated uprisings across eastern Ukraine, Avdiivka was briefly occupied by Russian proxy forces in April 2014, before Ukrainian troops regained control of the city 2 months later. Since then, with a clear line of sight from Avdiivka to Donetsk airport and the northern outskirts of the occupied city, Avdiivka was on the front line of Russia's war against Ukraine, and often the location of flare-ups in the fighting. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022, Russian troops overran Ukrainian lines along much of the old front line, but Avdiivka held strong, much in part due to the extensive fortifications built there over 8 years of fighting. The front line didn't move outside the city for a long time, but bit by bit, Russian forces made advances to the north and southwest of Avdiivka, slowly closing 2 large pincers around the bulge. By October 2023, the Ukrainian summer counteroffensive had culminated, and everyone was expecting Russian forces to take the initiative. On October 9th, Russia's offensive on Avdiivka began with a bang. With hundreds of armored vehicles and thousands of troops mindlessly thrown at Ukrainian lines. One by one, the attacks were beaten back by Ukrainian artillery and anti-tank fire, drones and mines, leading to some of the highest daily Russian casualty figures reported by Kyiv since the beginning of the full-scale war. With the front line in Ukraine bogged down in positional trench warfare, neither side had had any success attempting maneuver breakthroughs like this for the past year, and this time it was no different. Russia's initial assault did overwhelm the first line of defense north of Avdiivka, pushing Ukraine's 110th Mechanized Brigade back around 2 kilometers, while making minimal gains southwest of the city, where the 53rd Mechanized and 59th Motorized Brigades were deployed. We made a video describing the early offensive in more detail back then. You can check it out here. Russia's attempt to quickly encircle the whole city with a shock and awe pincer movement had failed miserably, but they were far from finished. In the following months, Russian forces focused their attention on the northern flank of the city, crossing the railway line and entering the village of Stepove. Here, Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade, freshly redeployed from the southern counteroffensive, held the line with distinction. It was on this ruined street where the most high-tech Russian tank, the T-90, was famously destroyed in a duel by a Ukrainian Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. As we entered 2024, the situation seemed difficult but stable. Under the surface, however, things were deteriorating for the Ukrainian defense. Before we reach the climax of this story, let's stop and have a look at what the fighting in Avdiivka really looked like on a tactical level. On one hand, much of what defined the Battle of Avdiivka has many similarities to the Battle of Bakhmut, just 50 kilometers away. A fortress city which Russia decided to take at all costs, and which Ukraine invested a lot in defending, even though surrounded on three sides. Russia using human wave tactics, wearing down the defense with brute force. Ukraine left with a difficult decision to stay or retreat as resupply roads came under fire, etc., etc. That's all true, there are plenty of parallels, but there are also some big differences which point to worrying signs for the future of the war. Firstly, manpower. Unlike in Bakhmut, where the bulk of Russian assault forces were made up of Wagner mercenaries, most of whom had been recruited from the prison system, those assaulting Avdiivka were a mix of regular troops, career, contract, and mobilized soldiers. More importantly, Russia had a lot more manpower in the fight than Ukraine. While Ukraine's defense of the city was led by 4 brigades and a handful of other separate battalions, much fewer than in Bakhmut, independent experts have estimated that Russia deployed up to 20 brigade regiment level units. This meant that while Ukrainian infantry often stayed for over a week at a time under attack on positions, Russian units could rotate in and out, attacking one by one to exhaust the fighting ability of the defending soldiers. Secondly, weaponry. Drones have played an unprecedented role in this war throughout, but it was only after the Battle of Bakhmut that FPV, or first-person view drones, became a mainstay on the front line. Ukraine was early to innovate, but Russia followed soon after, and by the time the fighting in Avdiivka reached its peak, both sides had so many FPV drones that even just one single enemy soldier, if spotted, could be the target of a high-precision strike. For Ukraine particularly, this made using the roads in and out of Avdiivka even more dangerous than in Bakhmut, once Russian forces got close enough. While Russia ramped up its use of small, high-precision weapons, the same can also be said for large, low-precision weapons. If you haven't guessed it already, I'm talking about air-dropped bombs, carrying 500 kilograms or more of explosives. Fitted with cheap gliding kits which improve their precision and allow them to be dropped away from Ukrainian air defense, these bombs can destroy any and all pieces of cover except for the strongest reinforced bunkers. In January, over 600 of these strikes were recorded in the Avdiivka area alone. Lastly, but most importantly, ammunition. During the Battle of Bakhmut, Ukraine still had decent stockpiles of ammunition for its Soviet-era artillery pieces, while NATO standard shells for Kyiv's new Western howitzers were being delivered at a steady rate. This time around in Avdiivka, the situation was much worse on both fronts. Ukraine has by now almost completely transitioned to NATO standard 155mm shells for its artillery. But because of the blockade of crucial funding for Ukraine in the US Congress, the flow of ammunition to Ukrainian crews has reduced to a trickle. Europe is scrambling to up its own defense production and deliver more of its shells to Ukraine. But for now, it's nowhere near enough without the US. Forced to use as few shells as possible, Ukrainian forces often simply do not have the firepower to stop Russian advances. After a period of relative stability, things started to get really dire for Ukrainian forces in Avdiivka around mid-January. After weeks of grinding assaults and endless bombardment, Russian forces approached the northern edge of the city, taking the first streets of a neighborhood of summer houses and coming up to the edge of the massive coke plant. Further gains brought Russian forces within 2 kilometers of the only sealed road into Avdiivka. The famous city sign, where Zelensky had taken selfies only weeks earlier, was now in easy range of Russian FPV drones. One local reported to me at the time that 8 out of 10 vehicles coming in and out of the city were getting hit. Around the same time, a daring Russian special forces operation managed to enter the city from the south, emerging from the sewers and entrenching themselves in nearby houses. Months of endless fighting were taking its toll on the Ukrainian units defending Avdiivka, especially the 110th Brigade, and over the following weeks, Russia was able to build further on their gains. In early February, Kyiv deployed one of the trump cards of the Ukrainian military to Avdiivka. the 3rd Assault Brigade. One of the largest brigades in the army, the 3rd Assault is well known for also being one of the most capable, holding the southern flank of Bakhmut for over a year. But by the time they arrived, it was too late to save the city. Given no time to arrive, learn the geography of the area, and establish themselves, the brigade was thrown straight into brutal urban fighting, backed as always by intense Russian bombardment from the air. Instead, the brigade ended up serving more to cover the withdrawal of the remaining Ukrainian forces in Avdiivka. A few days after they arrived, Russian forces crossed the railway line and finally cut off the only road into the city. More resembling a river of mud, the only other roads to safety could now only be traversed by tracked vehicles, or, with great difficulty, on foot. The situation was critical. By this point, not only was the fall of the city a complete certainty, but withdrawing safely had become a huge challenge itself. In some sectors, Ukrainian forces reportedly withdrew in an orderly fashion with minimal losses. In others, like at the fortified outpost known as Zenit to the south of the city, the withdrawal ended in tragedy. Getting a whiff of Ukraine's decision to retreat, Russian forces ramped up attacks on the fortress. The only way out was on foot, over kilometers of muddy terrain. According to reports from Ukrainian soldiers to the Kyiv Independent, at least 6 wounded fighters were left to be taken prisoner, and more were killed trying to escape. Though the Russian side promised that they would be evacuated and treated, at least 5 of the 6 soldiers were killed in captivity, the 110th Brigade later said. When it comes to Avdiivka, you can find varied analysis on the battle online that seems to exist in 2 different parallel worlds. Some people say that Avdiivka was not strategically significant, and that by taking it, Russia has only evened out the front line and will struggle to make further progress. Others say that the city was a crucial fortified stronghold, and that by taking it, Russia can more easily advance across the flat terrain into western Donetsk Oblast. The truth is more complicated. Put simply, the most important factor here is attrition. Syrskyi said himself that in Avdiivka, just like with Bakhmut, Ukraine's strategic goal was to use the ruined city to inflict as many casualties on Russian forces as possible, for as long as possible. Russian losses in the Battle of Avdiivka have been immense, and almost certainly several times higher than Ukraine's. The day after the city fell, the Ukrainian military put the figures for Russian losses at over 47,000 men and over 1,000 armored vehicles since the offensive began in October. According to pro-Kremlin Russian military blogger Andrei Morozov, better known on Telegram as Murs, the losses stood at around 16,000 men, even then around as much as in both Chechen wars combined. Just days after making these claims, Morozov was found dead, having apparently committed suicide. But despite the huge losses, Russia is maintaining offensive pressure all along the front line, now reportedly stepping up attacks on Robotyne in Zaporizhia Oblast, which Ukraine captured at great cost during its summer counteroffensive. Meanwhile, this doesn't mean any of Ukraine's own problems are going away. Yes, Ukrainian forces are now left with a shorter front line to defend in the area. However, many soldiers and commanders, both on social media and to me personally, have noted the poor effort made so far to build fortified lines of defense in the fields behind the city. More pressing is the ammunition situation, and it isn't getting better. Until Washington resumes deliveries of 155mm shells to Kyiv, the increasing disparity between Russia's and Ukraine's capacity to lay down artillery fire will make the fighting in the next big hotspot even more imbalanced. With spring around the corner, all eyes are on Congress. If the US aid is passed and Ukraine can dig in, they have every chance to hold the line over 2024. But if Kyiv is left to fight Russia without enough ammunition for the long term, the Battle of Avdiivka may just be the first in a series of tragic setbacks for the Ukrainian military. Whatever happens, we will be here to keep you in the know. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.